Gertie, and welcome to my video on understitching. I know this is a hot topic in the sewing world. It gives you really nice crisp edges. Once you start doing it, you're going to become addicted to it, and it's not hard to do, and it gives you great results. One thing that people usually talk about understitching on is collars, facings, that sort of thing. I'm going to talk about a different application of understitching today, which would be along the edge of a waistband, like this high-waisted Lucille trouser. This pattern's available on my Patreon, by the way. And you can use understitching along this curved edge here to get a really nice, crisp finish. You can also use it on collars. There are tons of applications for it, but today let's just talk about the mechanics of it, and I promise you it's going to transform your sewing. So let's get started. All right, so let's talk about our two pieces we're going to be sewing together. So in this example, let's say this green polka dot is your outer waistband, and you can see that it is interfaced, just like an outer waistband would be. And this is similar to a lot of the waistband designs that I do with this really cool 40s/50s inspired curved upper edge. And then you would also have a facing for the inside of your waistband. Okay, so we're gonna be sewing these two pieces together along the upper edge. So right sides together always. We're gonna pin these together, and then we'll be sewing them together at 5/8 of an inch. Almost all sewing patterns use 5/8 of an inch, right? So let's go ahead and just use that standard measurement for the seam allowance. All right, so we're gonna sew these together, again, right sides together, using a regular stitch length, so about 2.5 millimeters long. And back stitch. Back stitch at the other end. And now let's take this to the ironing board, and we're going to do some grating and notching. All right, so we are going to grade our seam allowances, and that just means trimming one seam allowance shorter than the other so that you don't see a ridge when you turn your seam allowances. So when you turn everything to the right side, you don't want to have those two seam allowances being the same length on top of each other, especially in thicker fabrics, because that can show a ridge on the right side of the fabric. So to avoid that bulk, what you want to do is grade the seam allowances, and the facing, let's say this is your waistband, the facing should be the shorter one, so about 1/8 of an inch like that. And then the waistband itself would be double that, so about 1/4 inch. All right, so two different heights just like that. So I'm gonna keep going here. So that is grading. The other thing I want to mention is clipping and notching. I always think of getting a crisp edge as having 3 steps. So first is your grading, and then clipping and or notching, and then your understitching, right? So these 3 steps kind of work hand in hand to create a really professional edge finish. So clipping and notching just means anytime you have a curve, you're going to be giving some sort of treatment to help the seam lay flat. So for an outer curve, like the one we have here, it's a subtle outer curve, but it is an outer curve, so it curves outward like that. You are going to want to do some little notches, okay? And a notch means a triangle cut out like that of your seam allowance. So don't cut through your stitching, obviously. Just cut close to it and cut out your notches. Now, on the other end of this spectrum would be an inner curve, right? So a neckline is a great example of something that curves inward. And for an inner curve, and let's just use this slight inner curve on the waistband here as an example. On an inner curve, you would do just some little clips. So you don't need to cut out a triangle. You just do a little snip into the seam allowance. And if you've ever had trouble with, turning a facing in or a lining in on the neckline and it's rippling and it's not laying flat, notching and clipping will 100% help you with that. Super important. Okay, so just continue to do any clipping and or notching. And then we are going to go to understitching. Now, I feel very strongly that pressing comes after understitching. I know that some people don't agree with me, but like I said, feel very strongly that this is the way to do it, okay? Because think of understitching as a tool to aid you in your pressing, okay? So we're gonna understitch first and then press. So, remember that this purple color here, this is the facing, so the side that's going to go towards the body. Green polka dots is the waistband or the outer layer. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to open these two layers out nice and flat, and it's really important to keep them nice and taut in the middle. Now your seam allowances should both be situated towards your lining or facing, okay? Facing in my case. So we want to make sure that these seam allowances are both going that way. And we are going to understitch the purple side or the facing side. So you want to be stitching about 1/8 of an inch from the seam line right here, okay? And so what you're doing, you're just using a regular straight stitch. What you're doing is you're stitching through your facing, but also catching your seam allowances underneath, okay? And what can happen, sometimes your seam allowances try to move back and forth underneath. You want to just use your right hand, just kind of sweep it underneath the fabric like this and make sure that your seam allowances are still underneath where you're going to be stitching, so underneath the facing side. Also continue to use your hands like this to just spread the pieces open so that you get a nice taut surface to understitch. All right, and you can see my stitching right along here. And it may not seem like much, but it's gonna make a huge difference in our pressing on the next step. So especially around this upper edge of the curve, just continue to spread those pieces. And also continue to check with your right hand that your seam allowances are underneath where you're stitching. The end. And now the pressing. To me, this is the most satisfying part of the whole thing because you see the work of your understitching come together. All right, so here's what we're going to do. You are going to place this on your ironing board with the understitched side facing you. And I always tell my students, it's like this kind of motion, right? You're like taking this seam line here, you'll feel like a hard edge of the understitching and you're rolling it outwards with your fingertips. So it goes as far out towards the edge of this piece as possible, right? So it's helping that seam line and the understitching roll out towards the edge. And then you're gonna press it. And I mean, depending on your fabric, you can use some steam. I'm using cotton right now, which loves steam. So I'm gonna press along there. I'm gonna continue down the upper edge of this waistband, just continuing to press out, do that rolling motion with my fingers to press the understitching so that it rolls all the way towards the edge of the piece. And now this is where you'll see the results of your work. See how beautiful. And you can give it like a nice little steam from the right side too. But if you have ever felt like you're not getting a nice professional finish or an edge finish on your garments, these 3 steps that we went over today, the grating, the clipping and the notching, and then the understitching, followed by a good press, will really, really help you get professional results in your sewing. So I hope you've loved these little tips and tricks, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.